Thank you.
Okay, let me just push my OK button. Okay. Yeah, so I'm really excited to chat with all of you. And hopefully I get to see many of you at AAPT this summer in person. So today, like Chris said, I'd like to tell you about how my research lab at Michigan State is building tools to assess changes in physics education. And if you'd like to follow along with the slides or have them for later, I put a QR code here so that you could access them. It will also be at the end as well. So if you're not convinced yet, hopefully you are at the end. So yeah, before I get into the details, I like to start out my talks with who I am and my story of how I got to where I am now. I'm originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we have a nickname of City of Champions. And as such, I'm an active sports fan, and I might be a little biased, but I think it's the best city in the world. And so if you have an opportunity to go there, you should email me, and I will give you all of my recommendations. I did my undergraduate studies at Slippery Rock University, which is about an hour north of Pittsburgh. There, I was a student athlete, majoring in physics and playing second base for the SRU softball team as an academic All-American. I then went to West Virginia University to do my graduate studies, where I did my master's degree actually in condensed matter physics, specifically working on the growth and characterization of a pretty unique material called topological insulators. But about halfway through my graduate career, I realized that I absolutely hated what I was doing. So I ended up switching into physics education research. And it turns out that this opportunity kind of fell into my lap. I was set to actually transfer institutions to pursue a PhD in STEM education when my dissertation advisors, John and Gay Stewart, were actually hired at WVU to begin a STEM education center called WVU Teach, as well as reform some of the introductory physics courses within the department, and particularly by starting a physics education research group. And so this really gave me the opportunity to do, really what I loved, which was research on the teaching and learning of physics. And so my dissertation was entitled An Exploration of Diversity and Inclusion in Introductory Physics, where I used large and multi-institutional data sets to really understand the inequities on the most commonly used physics assessment tools, such as the force concept inventory. And so after I defended, I ended up at Michigan State as a postdoctoral researcher under the supervision of Danny Caballero. Most of my work during that time was centered around developing formal structures to support the then newly transformed physics labs that had just been recently implemented. And so a lot of that work was specifically geared toward developing assessment tools and practices for understanding how students engage with specifically measurement uncertainty. And so lots of my early work has been centered around this idea of building and studying assessment structures within the physics classrooms. Then, right before the COVID-19 pandemic shutdown, like literally days before, I was offered a faculty position at MSU in the physics and astronomy department. And then in August 2020, I transitioned to a faculty member in our physics education research lab, where I get the amazing opportunity to work with all of these awesome folks here on the slide. Their support, I would say, throughout the first two remote years of this position was incredible. And my work has excelled because I have the opportunity to collaborate with these experts to really make my research story better than it was yesterday. Currently, we are one of the largest, if not the largest, PER group in the US. We are home to 6 principal faculty, 4 researchers and postdocs, 9 grad students, and at least 6 undergrads, which I know there are more. They're just hard to keep track of because there's so many of them. So there's really a lot going on in this greater physics education research lab. And so if you're interested in the specifics of what others do in Pearl, you can check out our website. We're doing updates right now, but all of our information is there. And then finally, since sometimes as faculty or instructors, we're viewed as robots, right, who only care about our research and our teaching, I like to make known that I also very much enjoy things outside of work. And so personally, my partner and I, we have the cutest little French bulldog at home. My partner, Lex, she's a medical assistant, and we both really like to do a lot of traveling. My dog's name is Judy. We call her Juju, and she loves her cuddles and her cheeseburger. And she's one of the only Frenchies that I know that enjoys outdoor activities like kayaking. Very high maintenance breed of dog, and I very rarely have any personal space, but I think she's just the cutest. So I have to show her on the slides. So that's a little bit about me and the group that I'm affiliated with. I'd like to now outline a little bit about what I'll be talking with you all today. So I entitled this talk, Building Tools to Assess Changes in Physics Education, Inclusively Supporting Student Learning and Retention. So I'd first like to discuss some of the motivation and background, and particularly why should we even care about assessment in general? And then why is it important to be thinking about equity and inclusion when discussing this area of educational research? I'll then talk about a couple of projects that my research team is currently up to, which I've broken down into 2 different chunks. The first chunk centers around the work that's being done to understand student learning in physics classrooms. And then the second chunk is about the efforts and tools that we've built to better understand student persistence in the sciences more generally. So let's start with some background and motivation. So why should we even care about assessment in physics? And why is it important to be thinking about equity and inclusion when talking about this area of educational research? And so a bit of motivation to my current work. In 1997, Elaine Seymour and Nancy Hewitt published a book entitled Talking About Leaving, where they discussed education research that was being conducted to understand why students are leaving the sciences. And I think Seymour and Hewitt do an excellent job avoiding what's called victim blaming or fixing the student, and point the reader to strategies beyond that fixing the student to really diversify the STEM community. And so from my perspective, this excelled many educators to begin to think about what about our teaching is pushing people away from STEM, and are our own institutions providing the necessary supports for all students to succeed in STEM. The arguments that came from this book essentially launched a national movement, I would say, to improve STEM education more broadly. Now, you might say, this book seems a little bit outdated. I know I don't look that old. I still get mixed up for being a student here on campus. But more recently, so in 2019, 20 years later, folks in STEM education revisited that topic, and these arguments are still evolving, right? Even though there may have been some improvement, there's still a lot of work left to do. And so we're still actively asking this question of how may the practices of STEM education be redesigned so that they more effectively foster interest, competence, and persistence in the sciences. So the sandbox that I play in, right, physics education research, or PER, has made major contributions to various practices and materials to reform instruction in order to both recruit and retain more students. And while this has been extremely promising for the field of physics, In the most recent Levers for Change report, which was a critical analysis of the research-based reform efforts in physics and astronomy, it was pointed out that reform in undergraduate assessment actually lags behind changes in other teaching practices. And so, in other words, assessment has not had much a part of the conversation in our reform efforts historically. Now, that's not to say, right, that there aren't researchers, right, across the STEM fields that are doing some really cutting edge work in terms of assessments. They, along with others in my field, have been developing tools that measure a wide variety of things that are important to our classrooms. Things like critical thinking and attitudes about experimental physics. Just to name a couple examples. I would argue that my research lab's work adds to this conversation by taking a lens of equity and inclusion when thinking about the advancement of our assessment tools. And making sure that our educational practices and tools within our classrooms are in fact more inclusive and equitable for all students that we serve. And so you might be asking, why should we even care about assessment, right, in physics education? And my answer is, as a physics educator, we would like to prepare our students for 21st century careers, right? So that they can go on and become successful scientists. And so in the most recent Phys 21 report, the authors outlined specific goals for departments and units that would promote career readiness, right? So there's physics-specific knowledge, scientific and technical skills, communication skills, professional and workplace skills. And while these goals were written for physics departments, right? I think it's fair to say in general, as a field, right, we would like to make sure that we're hitting these goals to ensure that our students are becoming successful, right? And in order to provide evidence of this, we need specific measurement tools in order to evaluate if and how well we're actually meeting these goals. I think, in addition, we should care about assessment reform because the population of colleges and universities is becoming more diverse, right, in terms of race, ethnicity, gender identity, age, et cetera, et cetera. And so to ensure student success, our educational practices should be equitable and inclusive. So science educators generally have explored various practices such as approaches to teaching, student development, campus advising, but largely, like I said before, assessment tools and practices has had, pretty limited space in that conversation. So for my work, I really lean into this quote that has stuck with me for years now from Montenegro and Jankowski, where they point out that assessment, if not done with equity in mind, privileges and validates certain types of learning and evidence of learning over others, can hinder the validation of multiple means of demonstration, and can reinforce within students the false notion that they do not belong in higher education. And so the question that I'd encourage you all to think about as I tell you more about what my lab is up to is the way we are assessing our students in our own classrooms equitable and inclusive? Okay, so hopefully at this point, I've convinced you a little bit about why we should care about assessment reform and that we should consider this equity and inclusion lens when building our tools. So now what I want to do is tell you a little bit about what my research lab has been up to in the past few years, building some educational instrumentation to support both student learning as well as persistence. And so in my group, we ground our work in the following question, which I presented earlier that came from the Talking About Leaving book. How may the practices of STEM education be redesigned so that they more effectively foster interest, competence, and persistence in the sciences? So when people come to me and ask, what's my lab all about? I point them to this diagram. And so to answer our grounding question, we use a mixture of quantitative and qualitative methodologies with this DEI lens to develop tools to study student learning within our classes, as well as develop tools that can support us in understanding persistence efforts at either the department or the college level. And so I'd first like to share a couple of projects that are centered around the instrumentation that's being developed to assess student learning within our classrooms. Now, learning is a really broad topic, right? And so I like to leverage the goals that promote career readiness that I presented earlier to really to share out about a couple of projects that my team is currently working on. So the first is, in fact, centered around the goal of physics-specific knowledge. And my team was awarded funds through the National Science Foundation to redesign the historic and rather problematic conceptual inventories that we use in our introductory physics classrooms pretty widely across the US, which are intended to measure physics-specific knowledge, particularly conceptual understanding of physical phenomena. Now, this project is run by a multi-institutional team. So myself, Dana Izadi are the PIs at MSU, with Jacob Kingsley, who is a recently graduated physics major from here. We have a team of physics education researchers at West Virginia, including John and Gay Stewart, and then their graduate students, Elaine Chrisman and Brett Ballard. And then we also have a team at Ohio State University, which is led by Andrew Heckler as the PI and his graduate student, Heather May. We also have commitments from other physics departments to help us out with this project, specifically from the University of Central Florida, New Mexico State University, Cal Poly State University. And through the first year of this project, we've begun to build additional partnerships with other institutions that are interested in joining our team. And so we're really looking for this project to be a community project, including a diverse set of types of institutions across the US. So why did we decide to bring this group together to redesign these legacy instruments? Well, I would say much of the literature centered around these assessment tools have shown that they have substantial problems that really limit their usefulness for research and instructional applications. My specific work demonstrated in my dissertation demonstrated that they have serious and potentially harmful demographic biases. And more generally, they feature items with artwork and contexts from, quite frankly, a different era, and really represent some limited diversity, I would say. This image here on the right is from the Force Concept Inventory. You might recognize it. And it was developed in 1992, which was a long time ago. And we, as the physics community, still use and rely on this instrument to evaluate students' conceptual understanding of Newtonian mechanics. And so the idea for this, the idea for this project was that if the physics community sees a tool like this as useful for evaluation, but it has problems such as, demographic biases, there is a need to develop something new and improved, and that's what we're trying to do here. So the overall goal of this project is to produce an assessment design model by leveraging what's called evidence-centered design, or ECD, to develop a set of valid, fair, and flexible items that instructors can use to build their own classroom assessments. And so to do this, our items are intended to be exceptionally well validated. We intend to administer them to hopefully around 15,000 students over the course of 3-year project. And this ECD framework grounds this new tool in both learning and measurement theory while considering the broad community-based approach that we would like to see. And so both of these bullet points here weren't necessarily considered when the force concept inventory was developed in the 90s. And so we're hopeful that we can address some of the lessons that we've learned to develop the next generation of conceptual evaluations that will be useful for many and fair to all. So what is this evidence-centered design thing? I would say if you get into the details, it's pretty complex assessment framework. However, how I like to explain it is it's really a tool that educators can use to design and develop assessments that ensure the collection of validity evidence from the onset of the item design. And so as one goes through this process, it really forces the test developer to be super transparent about what the question is actually intended to measure and how would we, as the quote unquote expert, would know that a student achieves mastery of such material. And so using this tool or this framework, this is kind of a big picture of what we propose to do. There's a lot going on here, so I'm going to walk through it. And the intention is to produce what we're calling a library of valid and fair items that assess students' conceptual understanding of topics within Physics 1 courses. Right now, we're just focused on mechanics. And a few things you'll notice in this box. First, this library of items will be broken down into what we're calling subscales of various topics or themes that are taught and particularly valued within Physics 1 introductory courses. The second thing is that this ECD framework allows space for community input on what are the subscales and topics that should be in this library of items. So really, it's a great opportunity to include many voices from the physics community to tell us about their priorities in terms of topic level learning goals and assessment strategies that they would find most useful. So we'd like this tool to be essentially guided by you all, physics instructors, not just the few PER experts that I showed on that slide, doing their thing over here and it not being applicable to the broader community. And then lastly, one of the subscales that we intend to produce is one that can be cross-normed with the legacy instruments, meaning that the data from some of the newly developed items can be compared with the outcomes that many departments have using these legacy instruments. Right? The idea here is we would hate for all of the copious amount of longitudinal data that many colleges and universities have collected and probably still collect today just go to waste, right? And so we're trying to be as mindful as we can toward that. And so once those items within that library are established and validated, we intend to have this tool or this library accessible to instructors where they can select desired items or scales to then have a customizable assessment tool consistent of well-validated and fair questions that are aligned for their own classroom needs. And so over the past year, we have been developing items, and we started with one-dimensional kinematics, assuming that most, if not all, introductory physics courses value this topic. And so what we're working with here is what we're calling a conceptual knowledge model for 1D kinematics. But to give you a quick flavor of our process in developing these items, what I wanted to highlight here is that we have concepts within 1D kinematics, things like position, velocity, acceleration, and time, right on the top row. And then we have various representations that we can use to assess students' mastery of such concepts, and those are on the bottom. And so within this space, right, we can pick and choose what concept to focus on when using this ECD framework. to develop an item for a particular representation. So for example, here, if we choose to assess the concept of velocity using a graphical representation, we can use this ECD tool to design a learning goal or performance expectation, along with the evidence that would allow us to become confident that a student has achieved mastery of that performance expectation. So for example, we'd like students to use a graphical representation to convert a description of the change in location of an object as a function of time to evaluate the instantaneous velocity at a given point. And the evidence that might convince us that a student has achieved that mastery is that they know velocity is a vector quantity, or the slope of a position versus time plot is the velocity of an object. Those are just examples of evidence that might convince us. But by transparently documenting both our goals and what students need to know to reach those goals, we can then use that information to write an example assessment item around those things. And so here's an example that I'm sure many of us here have seen, or maybe even asked our students to do. They're asked to rank the instantaneous velocity at various points. And a correct answer to the item would mean that they can demonstrate each piece of evidence of mastery, while other answers would give us insight into what pieces of knowledge they do understand and where, as the instructor, can we better support their learning. So this is just an example of how the item development happens. Currently, we've developed over 50 items just for the 1D kinematics scale. And we're now in the process for validating these items, both with experts as well as with students. And then we're also starting to develop our first scale for Newton's laws. So if you remember back to, right, the overall goal, right, this item bank, we want it to be informed by the community. And so there are many, many ways to get involved here. So if you're a physics instructor or know somebody who is, we'd love to have you as a partner in this effort. We do have a website with a participate link. It's just a short 3-question survey. And then we will be in contact with you depending on your specific level of interest in becoming involved. So that was the first project I wanted to share. But the Phys 21 report, right, didn't just state that physics-specific knowledge was the only goal that departments and units should focus on, right? Scientific and technical skills are also an important goal that promote career readiness. And so now I want to tell you about a project that my lab is working on within this goal. And so we have a project going on called the AMAS project, or Assessing Mathematical Sense-Making in Science, which is a multi-institutional and cross-disciplinary initiative to design tasks that elicit mathematical and science sense-making within physics, chemistry, and biology courses. Many amazing people on this slide here. We have our team at MSU, myself in physics, Melanie Cooper in chemistry, and Kevin Hodek in biochemistry. We're collaborating with Anita Schukart at the University of Minnesota, who's in biology education, Jennifer Kaplan at Middle Tennessee State University, who is in math education, and Michael Fleming over in the California State University system, who is in biology education as well. So big team and cross-disciplinary. And what we've been doing is we are attempting to blend 2 frameworks together to develop and test assessment tasks that are intended to elicit this skill of mathematical sense making, right? The two frameworks are three-dimensional learning for undergraduate science assessment framework and the mathematical sense-making framework developed actually by Anita and her group, who is directly part of our team. And so we're using these two things as kind of our lens to develop these tasks. And of course, where I really love this evidence-centered design framework. And so we're leveraging a modified version of ECD in our development process. So I recognize that that's a lot of frameworks. And so just really quickly, if folks are interested, I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what those frameworks actually are. And so the 3DL for us was extended directly from the next generation science standards, where there are three important pieces that we should consider when students are learning within our classrooms. Core ideas, scientific practices, and then cross-cutting concepts. This particular 3D learning project was led by Melanie Cooper, who's also on our team, along with other collaborators across various STEM disciplines. And it was really designed to help departments and instructors develop a more robust gateway curriculum at the undergraduate level, and specifically think about how could instructors design science assessments that blend these three dimensions of learning, right? The core ideas, the scientific practices, and the cross-cutting concepts. And so we're using that, and we're blending those three aspects of learning with a theoretical model of what a blending of science and math sense-making looks like. And so as students think about mathematical representations in science, they may consider the mathematical context, the science context, or merge these perspectives in a blended process, right? Which presumes that students draw from both the math knowledge and the science knowledge to solve such a problem. And so we're leveraging this, what we're calling Sci-Math sense-making framework that was, like I said, developed by one of our partners, which has been used to identify opportunities for sense-making at this math-science interface, but within biology. So this framework was developed in biology, and we'd like to see how it works in other disciplines as well, particularly on assessment tasks that students are engaged in within physics, chemistry, and biology classes. So what does this look like in practice? Each discipline has developed their own for their intro courses. And this here is an example that we just recently tested here at MSU. And this structure should look similar, right? Because it's grounded in the evidence-centered design framework, right? We have our performance expectation that we expect our students to master. But this time within this claim, we have the three pieces, right? We have a core idea, which here is energy conservation. We have a scientific practice or skill, which is developing and using models. And then we have our cross-cutting concept, which is within or between systems. And so again, from this really transparent documentation of our goal and our evidence that would allow us to become confident that a student has mastered that goal, we can develop an assessment item, right, that students can engage with and that are intended to elicit this mathematical sense-making idea. And so, for example, the item that we gave to students most recently centers around Sage's newfound passion for snowboarding and modeling the energy as he slides down the half pipe, right? Which is pretty relevant considering we have lots of snow outside already. And we're hoping that, like I said, with this item, we're eliciting students' mathematical sense making throughout it's actually a 4-part item, but we'll see. We gave it to around 300 students last semester, I guess in the spring, on their exam. And so we're currently looking at the overlap between our evidence statements and this mathematical sense-making framework that was developed in biology that I mentioned earlier. So we'll see what comes from this. I'm not convinced that we can elicit such a skill like sense-making in like a one static assessment, particularly one that's relatively high stakes, right? It's one of 3 exams. So I really would like to do some classroom observations of students working in groups on this problem, and then kind of compare those results and make an argument for how does one engage in sense making. So that was an overview of a couple of the projects that have been happening to support student learning within our classroom. With the time left, I'd like to shift to the second strand of tool building, where we've been focused on building methods that can help support retention or persistence efforts on our campuses. So as before, I just wanted to give you all a little bit of the motivation that propelled some of this work. In the early 2000s, there were a couple of pretty nice papers that I think do a great job outlining what variables are predictors of retention. And what I like about this analysis is that they demonstrated that, sure, traditional predictors such as high school GPA or ACT, SAT scores have a pretty strong correlation with student retention, but also other psychosocial variables have a strong correlation with retention as well. And so here, for example, in this table, high school GPA has a sizable correlation with persistence of about 0.24, but also academic self-efficacy has a strong correlation of 0.26. And so my work is not meant to argue which of these variables in our model is more important over the other when considering thinking about retention models. My work is driven by how do we actually measure these types of motivational variables that are within these models, right? So for example, ACT score is just a score, a number given after the student takes the assessment. But what about the psychosocial factors that are also important to the persistence of students in STEM? Things like academic self-efficacy. So most of my foundational background is in quantitative methods. So a lot of the stuff that I read leverage surveys as their tool of measurement. Researchers sometimes use a one-time survey measurement to look at things like differences across groups, for example, or they use it in a regression analysis to predict some outcome. Others might use surveys as a pre-post measurement over, let's say, an academic semester to investigate the impact of some, classroom intervention or small curriculum change that they may have made over that semester. However, many of us who care about measurement would argue that with the complexity of such a construct like self-efficacy, a one-time measurement or a pre-post design really limits us in deeply understanding the impacts that curricular or co-curricular activities have on students. So more generally, right, a quantitative survey approach has little opportunity to really get into the fine-grained details about a student's experience, right? It just gives you a signal with limited opportunity to explain either the how or the why behind that signal. And so because of this limitation, I turned to my qualitative experts. And I think most of them would say a lot of their qualitative measurement tools for these non-academic factors leverage reflective interviews to maybe explore student experience over a semester or over an academic year. But just like quantitative measurement, right, there are limitations to the qualitative methods that are traditionally used. So for example, a distal reflection may limit us connecting what particular event may have impacted a student in that moment. And I would say more importantly, the size of that impact, right? There's this reliance on memory, which makes it difficult to understand what impact particular events may have on a student's experience. So when thinking about what it means to measure, right, these quite complex motivational constructs, what if we were to blend these two methodologies together, right? To better understand students' experiences and the impact of those experiences on, let's say, self-efficacy, right? There's a need to develop a research design that can be useful while mitigating some of the limitations that are present in the more traditional designs. And so that, so broadly, that's what my team is really trying to do here. Now, when I start to talk about my team, I should begin with how it all started to allow for some specific context for what we're trying to accomplish. So during my time as a postdoc, I was finishing up some work centered around student self-efficacy or their confidence in one's ability to successfully perform a task. And it turned out that I had and continue to have a fellow colleague and friend, Vashi Sautel, which I'm sure many of you recognize. She is an expert in self-efficacy theory and has been studying it over the course of her career, but is a qualitative researcher. So I would say through many formal and informal discussions, maybe with some beers involved, it turns out that our priorities are very similar. And we decided that it would be a great idea to pull our expertise together and come up with a mixed methods research design to study this complexity of the development of a student's self-efficacy, while hopefully mitigating some of the limitations that we've seen independently in our own work. So where we've landed, one day of data collection looks like this, where we have a quantitative piece or surveys through what's called the experience sampling method, or ESM, to collect signals of one's confidence, right? Followed up by a qualitative piece through what we call an individualized daily journal prompt to really ask the student about the nuanced details that could further explain the signal that they reported. Now, before I show you some results, I want to take some time to describe what each of these pieces looks like. I'll start with the ESM, or the experience sample method, which is the quantitative piece. So generally, the ESM is a means of collecting information about both the context and the content of the daily life of an individual. Specifically, it asks individuals to provide responses to both open and close-ended questions at random points throughout the day, right? It was actually developed in the 70s at the University of Chicago to study everyday experiences using journal prompts. And you'll see a lot of this methodology used in psychiatric or psychological treatment studies. And so in the field of physics education research, it's more recently been used by Nissen and Shemwell, and they used it to study high school students' experiences with interactive engagement in physics classrooms. So that's a little bit of history background. How are we particularly using it? So in our context, right, we're using it to measure student self-efficacy by utilizing a phone application where our students are randomly notified between 9 and 5, Monday through Friday. Generally, we do this for a 2 to 4 week period. During each of these random notifications, right, we ask them to answer a really short survey probing into what they are doing in that moment and their self-efficacy towards those activities. And so specifically, students are first asked open-ended task level questions. So what is the main thing you are doing right now? Where are you doing this activity? Then we probe their task level self-efficacy from items which asked on a scale of 0 to 100, how skilled are you in this activity? How in control do you feel? And are you succeeding at what you're doing? Then since these notifications are, random throughout the day, we do ask them if the activity that they're engaged in is for a course that they're currently enrolled in, or is it something outside of a course. So in practice, we start with this quantitative data collection via this ESM notification thing, where students are filling out, right, these in the moment surveys. And then during the data collection period, we quickly observe this survey data per student to then write a individualized daily journal prompt that provides the student the opportunity to reflect on their experience more proximal to the event that occurred throughout their day. So we're trying to mitigate some of this distal memory limitation that we see in qualitative interviews. So what might this look like? This here is just a silly example that my graduate student made up for talks, and I thought it was great. So, but overall, we're probing directly into the in the moment experience at the end of the day, closer to when that moment happened. So, for example, a journal prompt might be, today in the app, you told us you were making a sandwich. We noticed you indicated you were on the extremely side of the scale for feeling skilled. What were you thinking of when you answered, how skilled are you in this activity? And a student might come back and say, I was closer to extremely side of the scale because I have made multiple sandwiches for multiple years, and they've always tasted good before, right? And so this kind of, it showcases how we're trying to connect their response in the random notification from the phone application and asking them to expand upon that experience. And in this case, making a sandwich, which is kind of silly, but you could imagine doing a homework for a physics class, right? So altogether, right, one day of data collection looks like this, where we have, right, the quantitative piece and then the qualitative piece. We've done this for many, many students. And so you can imagine that there is just a ton of data to be analyzed here. But let me give you just a flavor of what the data looks like through an example where we can see some cool stuff happening and what we're learning through this research design. So this here is just one example from one of our students, participant 6, where both notification 3 and 4 were centered around a research course that they were currently enrolled in. And the task for notification 3 was working on my research project, where they reported their self-efficacy to be 40, 66, and 62. And then the task for notification 4 was putting my findings for this week for my research project into a presentation where their self-efficacy that they reported jumped to 87, 183. And so as we're collecting this data, we noticed this pretty large shift in their reported signal and really wanted to probe into what is going on, right? What made this shift happen over the course of a couple hours, right? And so we wrote a specific prompt. Yesterday, it stood out to us that your confidence in your abilities in said research course was notably higher. Could you tell us what was happening yesterday? What were you doing? Who were you working with? What impacted your sense of confidence? And so the student replies with, what made my confidence get much higher in that course was a combination of two things. I went above and beyond of what was asked of me and did more than just look at some data that I was given, but I made a full PowerPoint presentation. The second point that gained me confidence was from this was that my research mentor was very impressed and made a point to compliment many specific details. And so here we're beginning to see a connection between the shift in self-efficacy toward the specific task that the student was engaged in. And then through this daily journal prompt, right, the student here was had the opportunity to expand upon what actually impacted that shift in their confidence. Now, this is just one example of what we see in our data, but we're hopeful that this tool could be pretty helpful for designing interventions to better support students throughout either their time in our classrooms or on our campuses more broadly. We also know that because this design is pretty new, there's a lot of work left to do validating this method, making sure that it's measuring what it's doing, what we think it's doing. We have many folks working in a few different spaces. Carissa Myers, who is one of my senior grad students, is working toward validating this design and thinking about what are the affordances and limitations, right? This is her dissertation work, and her first paper should be submitted hopefully in January. Vicky Foon is our postdoc in our research lab, and she is actually looking to use this method in a new context at community colleges to explore the experiences of students at our partner institutions. So we have a couple of grants that we partner with local community colleges here in the state of Michigan. And so we would really like to put this methodology in those spaces to really highlight the tremendous amount of wonderful work and programmatics that our community college partners do to support student success. And then finally, generally, we need to validate our survey, right, that we're giving with a large number of students. And so John Bird, who's a third-year grad student, is working on both the internal and external validity of the items in particular. And so again, we're hopeful that this novel mixed methods design will be helpful in designing interventions to better support these retention efforts. But before making, any claims around student experience, we've been putting a lot of emphasis validating our measurement tool within that design. So with that, let me try to summarize what I talked about today. So generally, the folks in my group, right, ground their work in the following. How may the practices of STEM education be redesigned so that they more effectively foster interest, competence, and persistence in the sciences? And we use a mixture of quantitative and qualitative methodologies with this DEI lens to build tools that help support the assessment of student learning, as well as retention efforts more broadly. Coming back to my motivation of why we should care about assessment, we as educators, right, are preparing our students to be 21st century scientists. And these goals that are outlined in the FIS 21 report show four main goals that are intended to promote career readiness: physics-specific knowledge, scientific and technical skills, communication skills, and then professional and workplace skills. And so we should develop tools, right, to evaluate if we're reaching each of these goals. And if an additional goal of our programs or our universities or our colleges is to increase the diversity of our student population, the importance of fairness, validity, and accessibility in our educational tools is greater than ever, right? As we continue to reform our teaching practices and curriculum to improve physics education for our undergraduate students, assessment needs to be a part of that conversation, right? In general, I think we need more sophisticated instruments developed using more advanced techniques so that we can ensure that our materials are both inclusive and equitable for all students in our classroom and at our institution. So it's important to remember, as Montenegro and Jankowski state, right, assessment, if not done with equity in mind, can reinforce within students the false notion that they don't belong in higher education. And so how can we as educators ensure that we're assessing our students in an inclusive manner so that they can become successful future scientists? With that, I'll end by saying thank you to all of the wonderful people that I collaborate with and the students that I've had the pleasure of directly mentoring through their research experience. And then, of course, recognizing the funding agencies that support all of this work. And then I'll take any questions. And maybe if it's okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see your faces.
Makes a lot of sense.
Excellent.
So a lot of things to think about. We have one question in the chat from Allison. What are your thoughts on the best methods of administering your improved assessments? Individual versus group work, written exam versus project or presentations, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. I try to, at least in my coursework, I try to diversify the set of opportunities that students can show their learning, right? So whether that's individualized, whether that's within a group, whether that's a written exam or a presentation, right? So I try to, the forms of assessment in my classes, I try to really give a breadth of opportunity that students can engage in, right? Because not all students are going to do well on a written exam, right? Some are going to do better on an oral presentation, right? Because they have the freedom to tell a story, right? As opposed to do, numerical calculations, right? For example. So I wouldn't say there's necessarily a best method. I think the best thing that you can do is provide a robust set of opportunities for students to showcase their learning. I hope that answered your question. Yeah, go ahead, Anthony.
Um, I was just wondering, with the sorry, the what does the E stand for? Is it experience sampling method?
Experience sampling method. Yep.
So, has that already been like kind of implemented with the community college students, or
Yes, it has. It has. So we, as part of our STEM grant here at MSU, we partner with two community colleges, one in Ann Arbor and one in Flint, Michigan. And so Vicky, over the past year, has collected, well, implemented first last spring, right? There was some hiccups in that, right? Because their resources are different than our resources, right? And so we needed to navigate how we actually implement this mixed methods approach in that context. And then this fall, we really honed in on what methodology works for our community college partners. And she's actually analyzing that data right now. But a lot of things that are coming out of it are really, really positive. Right? Like, I mean, our community college partners do so many great things for student success and have so many programs that they've implemented, and students are supported, right? And so we haven't, I mean, our feedback to our partners is that you're all doing the things. Thank you for doing the things, right? We should learn from you. So yeah.
yeah, I guess I was interested, just and maybe this is really not really more of a minor thing, but just the implementation of like how you get this, very frequent responses from the community college students. Did you have to like tailor it all in terms of like how you collected the responses uh, than you would for the MSU students? Just because maybe I'm just sort of old fashioned. Just the idea of like having these like notifications, out of frequent just seems very different than what I'm used to.
Yeah. So I would say the two things come to mind, right? Like one is logistical in terms of, right, like we use for the daily journal prompts, we use Microsoft OneNote, right? Because MSU has access to that, right? But turns out one of our community college partners, you can't, I don't know, something, their system doesn't accept our invitations or something. So we needed to work around that, right? We used a different emailing system, right? We had to care about human subjects training, things like that, right? So that was more logistical. I would say what we learned in the spring was, and as you all are aware, right, these students have very different experiences than we see our students here at MSU having, right? They work a lot, they have families, they're older, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we changed in the fall was actually our pre-survey to better understand what does their overall life look like, right? When are they working, right? When are they doing homework? What big events do they have coming up, both personally and academically, right? And so I think, yeah, the pre-survey is what's coming to mind for me about like the really big change that we had to make, because we wanted to better understand what their lives looked like, right? To yeah, understand the data that we were collecting.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I kind of have a technical kind of question just in terms of analyzing so much data. I mean, how does that look?
Yes, great question. I think we're fortunate to have a large lab, right? And we're fortunate to bring in many grad students who are interested in this kind of work. And so, yeah, I mean, I will say that this mixed method is pretty expensive, both not just financially, but like time expensive. Right? Like our grad students and postdocs are on, I mean, essentially they're on experiment for 4 weeks, right? At a time where every day they're analyzing data, right? And writing these journal prompts. And so I would say some of the affordances there, right? Like the limitation is that they're basically like they go away for a month, right? And they're just data collecting, right? But I think the affordance of that is when they turn to the analysis phase, they really have a sense of who this student is and what the experience is that they're going through, instead of just pushing the button, collecting the data, and then trying to understand the student, right? They're understanding the student through the process. But yeah, it's so much data. And so, thinking about, I would say one person can do, I would say 15 would be the maximum number of students at one time, to really get, that individualized nature of the journal prompts. So scaling up is definitely a question we have, but I think Vashti and I feel a little bit uncomfortable with that until we know what the method is actually doing on a case by case basis. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
It's more on the first part of your talk, 'cause that was a different project, right?
Yeah.
Where you were talking about. And I have not having any just being a physics person teacher as opposed to a education researcher. How you like I can see the abstract like FCI type stuff, and then I can see like I know what I do in my classes to assess, and like what's the like how do those reach each other from like in what you're doing? Because I think your goal is to go from one to the other to kind of like touch all aspects of assessment, but it's like there's reasons things like FCI have been broadly implemented, and other stuff's much harder to like. It's like how do you connect those disparate things?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's a really good question. And quite honestly, a question we're asking the community is like, what are the assessment strategies that you use in your classroom already? Because we want to design something that is useful to you, right? And so, we needed to start at a place where we as physics instructors know that most people value, right, 1D kinematics, and, questions about position, velocity, acceleration, right? But there are certainly what's coming out in the community aspect when we're interviewing physics instructors is that there are other things that outside of content that are valued in the classroom. And so we planned, like, that's the next step, right? Like this item, this library of items can be really massive, right? And the goal is that by the end, that physics instructors are actually contributing to it as well, so that it's a community developed resource that's useful to physics instructors. And so I'm thinking a lot about, right, because the FCI was written to be a summative assessment, right, pre-post across your semester or whatever. Whereas I think these items could be utilized as more of a formalized assessment, where, kind of like clicker questions, for example, right, where you could really see, closer to when the students are learning the material, how you can better support them in that learning, right? I could imagine at the end of a class period, you ask a couple questions, you reflect on it and say, oh, well, 40% of my students didn't recognize that velocity is a vector quantity. So we should go over that again, right? For example. So yeah, so does that answer your question, Libby? Okay. It's good to see you too.
Anthony had a question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was looking at the website for the evidence center assessment, and kind of
Uh-huh.
looking at the item library.
Uh-huh.
And I guess I kind of noticed that a lot of or I think a lot of the questions seem to be kind of like stripped of like uh, like real world context. It seemed to be like objects moving along like the x-axis, or um, and then I kind of refamiliar ourselves with like the FCI, where it's a lot of like planes and bowling balls and hockey pucks. And I guess I could definitely see how that like removes any kind of like problematic representations. Um, do you lose anything if you sort of just have it kind of um, more just like objects, generic objects moving under generic coordinate axes? And like, is that something that maybe we as instructors should maybe consider when we develop our own assessments?
That's a good question. I would say right now I don't have the answer for you. But my answer is that the baseline of these very generic items that don't have, real world contexts give us a baseline to explore what we gain when we ask with real world applications, right? Because right now we just lean on the FCI, which is pretty problematic, right? And so having a base, like a foundation of items that we can go in different directions to see what's best for our students in the now instead of in the 90s, right, is the goal. So I think that's a really great question. And so, I'm certainly open to, partnering on a project that would say, take the 1D kinematics and change, the object to something real, right? And see what happens, right?
It's funny because I think about like you want to make it more relevant to students, so you move from like the box sliding down an incline, so you have it try and do something physical, but then you realize that not everyone has experience with that physical situation, so then
Right.
that's problematic, or it's not everyone has that as like a resource or a common um, experience, so then you end up back at the box on the incline, and so it's kind of this weird thing where it's like
Yep, absolutely. I think the one of the items that's on the FCI that is gender bias is the rocket problem. And interestingly enough, I don't know if this has to do with the gender bias, but this is all anecdotal. Somebody at a conference came up to me and said a lot of their international students don't have experience, like what does thrust mean in this case? And so just like a small choice in language, right, can have a big impact on, students showcasing their learning, right? Because they don't they don't have experience with that, right? And that's not their fault, right? And so that moment, I think, for me was like, yeah, we should be super careful, and you know, qualitatively validate these items with a diverse population of students so that we are confident that they're understanding what we're trying to measure.
I had a colleague who was saying that on some exam, that was a projectile motion one, and it involved scoring a goal, and the bar was a certain height, and the native born American students assumed it was football and you had to get over the bar, and the international students assumed it was soccer and you had to get under the bar, right? And I was like, yeah. And then what about all the students who don't have a picture for the sports thing?
Right, right.
And
Yeah,
so, what's the bar have to do with the
right.
the
Yeah,
scoring?
I see Joe's comment, because never good enough to play sports as a student, right? So some students might not play or watch or have any experience with sports. So yeah, that's a great point.
I'm also kind of curious, like, you had that one slide that got into like the weeds of like position, velocity, coordinate system, position, velocity, acceleration, and then like the different things you might want people to know about. Like, I mean, I'm thinking like if I had to sit down and try and break down what I taught, like that's like a significant, right? To try and pull out what are the main ideas, what are the ways that we like think, that we commonly test on these, um, and I think there'd probably be, like you said, a lot of alignment on 1D kinematics, but I'm guessing much beyond that, you find that individual people have very different ideas about what the thing is, and what might show, like even how you decide if someone's answer would show competency. I mean, it gets really hard to get that specific to where like a room full of people could all look at what some student did and agree on what that equated to in terms of like their score. I'm just thinking about assessment for our accreditation stuff going discussions on our campus right now that like fall into that like realm, and kind of I'm just curious if you have thoughts on like, okay, so you can kind of put here like how are you going through those things, have you tried to do it for more stuff, how are you deciding like what meets the bar, what doesn't, based on, because like I said, it can get very individual, especially the further on into the coursework.
Yeah, great question. So I think the conclusion that our team has come up with is that we're actually never going to reach consensus, right? And so rather we're trying to position this as we developed a thing and we want to be super transparent about what the thing is intended to do so that an individual instructor can make a decision. Oh yeah, I agree with that. Let me use it. Or, oh no, I don't agree with that. Let me design something new and contribute to the database or whatever. So I think we are working very hard on trying to collect the experiences of physics instructors across the country. So we're asking folks, we've done a blast out to currently 75 institutions, physics departments across a diverse set of types of institutions, and are asking instructors to fill out a quick survey about their course, and particularly around their learning goals and their assessment strategies so that we can better understand kind of those nuances of what they value, right? And what's next. Within that survey, we do have we have a set of topics and ask the participant to rank them. And it turns out there's lots of contention on what's first, forces or energy. So we decided to go with forces next. Whether or not that's the right decision, we'll see. We'll eventually get to energy, right? And so everybody will eventually be happy, whichever side of the coin you're on. But so yeah, so the idea here is for us not to make decisions, but be in the decisions that we make are informed by the broad, like, physics instructors, what are their wants and needs.
Yeah,
We
thanks.
all should participate.
Yes. I mean, it's an interesting idea too, because I think like if you can model the process a little bit for people, then it gives them a way to think about it for things they're doing that either aren't directly connected or, just how like patterns and habits of thinking they could take anyways to what they're doing that's not done for that specific topic. So it's kind of a neat idea. I almost wonder, like, would it benefit students to see that list?
I like that.
I mean, either it's going to overwhelm them or I mean, like it could be beneficial for some, or it could make them feel like there's just all these little details they have to memorize how to do or something.
Right.
But like, it could be interesting to see if that like helped them understand what people were looking for on their quizzes or their tests.
Right. Yeah. I mean, right, that's the purpose of learning goals and rubrics, right? Which is essentially in the this is why I like the ECD framework so much, is that structure is performance expectations and evidence statements, right? Basically. And so, I like that thinking. I wonder what we could do with that. That would be interesting.
Yeah. My last question, other people have stuff you should jump into, but you mentioned the math reasoning, and I didn't know if you were familiar at all with Suzanne Brahmia's work around that, and if it had some commonalities, because they're doing a lot, I think mostly with like ratio and proportional reasoning. But
Yeah. I actually, Charlotte Zimmerman just was our seminar speaker last semester. Unfortunately, I taught during seminar, so I couldn't attend, but I do know that there is some overlap. I think their design of their assessment tool is more narrow than our sense making approach. Whereas we made a choice around, right, the 3 dimensions, where I think that from my understanding, they're really focused on that cross-cutting concepts of like what is the math that is useful across STEM disciplines, right? So I think it's tangential, and I think it could definitely talk to one another in the literature, but like what happens when you add, a core concept and a scientific practice to their their item, do things change, for example? But yeah.
I'll jump in with sort of a big picture. If you had a magic wand and you could completely reform physics assessment to be equitable, what would you like to see?
Learning goals. I mean, quite frankly, it sounds simple, but I think during like this research process and, finally being within a department, and looked at as the teaching expert, right? Being a member of Pearl is, I think we as physics faculty, need more experience writing our goals before we think about anything else, right? And because in my mind, if you don't have those, what are you doing? You're just making students crazy.
Regarding the learning goals, would you tend to favor very finely grained learning goals or more coarser grained learning goals?
Yeah, great question. I think it depends on where those learning goals are being presented, right? So I think that, how I try to do things is, right, I have my course level learning goals on my syllabus, for example, but I try really hard to design daily goals for my section, right? And making sure that those very fine-grained goals that we're going to tackle today align with the coarse grained goals that are in my syllabus. Does that make sense? So I think the answer to your question is like a both and, depending on where it's being presented to the students.
I struggled with that when I switched to a standards-based grading over a decade ago, and I opted for the more coarser grain ones because it saves space. There are fewer of them, and I could subsume more of the finely grained ones. But, I'm just wondering if there's a better way to do it. I mean,
I would also say what's helped me too is when I'm designing my assessment, my summative assessment, whether it's a midterm or a final, having those daily goals written out, for myself, I could make a less fine-grained goal that I'd like to assess, right? So I'm not trying to assess each little fine-grained goal that we did over the course of, 6 lectures or whatever. Rather, I'm trying to say, okay, over these, 18 learning goals, what are the themes that are coming out here? And I want to assess those themes. So I think doing, for me at least, doing learning goals by day has been super helpful in my design of my assessment tools within the classroom.
I think it's like I get caught up kind of in that too, Joe, like where you're like, well, there's the big picture of being able to solve, a kinematics problem. Then there's all these other like little support things that are part of it too, like the coordinate system and like recognizing the sign of the acceleration. And so like then there's all these tiny things, but really to meet that bigger one, you have to have like get those in some ways at some point you have to just depend on those being there so that you can get to these other ones, and it's like then it feels overwhelming and it's like, oh, just not worry about it. That's right usually.
I would also say that utilizing this ECD framework, you can design your course material around both the learning goal and the evidence statements, right? And so like maybe students knowing velocity is a vector quantity is not actually your learning goal. It's a piece of evidence to a bigger learning goal, right? But you're going to design an activity that connects those two things, that includes velocity is a vector quantity, right? So it's not necessarily like it can be in the goal as well as like what pieces of knowledge do the students need to have to successfully master that goal. Maybe that might help pull out of the weeds a little bit, possibly.
So I was just gonna chime in real quick. One thing I found that's really helped me with that like whole process is sort of more of a backwards design approach with my teaching. So it's like I know that I want to test them on these 3 main things, and then I figure out my teaching and learning goals based on those 3 things. So like I don't figure out the individual assessments first. It's more the bigger picture. And then I'm going to have demos for that, and I'm going to show simulations for that. And it helps me anyway, working backwards like that. So that's just another suggestion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. I was about to mention backwards design as well, and which I always found to be kind of a misnomer because it's like if you don't know where you're going, how are you going to get there?
Right. And hence you're just driving students crazy because nobody knows where you're going.
So, I think with this, we should probably call it an end. If you can take a moment to fill in our evaluation give us feedback on the session, that would be great. I'm just going to put a link in the chat and also give a quick shout out on the slides here. Did it work? Yay! All right. So find out more about what's happening with optics and future PER events on our website. And everything that gets recorded is on our YouTube channel. And we have a newsletter that you can subscribe to as well. So thank you. Can I stop sharing? And thank you so much, Rachel, for this. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris, Anthony, Kareem, and Sherry for the invitation. And hopefully I'll see most of you at AAPT in the summer. So